Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Christopher Dalton, and we've had some interaction off and on over the last year and a half or so, maybe. And we've kind of come back together, and I've invited him on the podcast. And welcome, Chris, and glad you're here. And um, I, I normally ask people to describe themselves, but I think I just like to say, what do you want to talk about? What's on your mind today that you would like to have some conversation on?
I feel ready for anything, honestly. In the sense that I'm actually terribly nervous, frankly. But honestly, I'm just happy to be here and I really appreciate what you do on this podcast. And so anything I can do to just be part of that is
Well, let
worthwhile.
me ask you this: what is it that you see is happening with this podcast? What is it?
Relational paradigm shift. Relational paradigm shift. So we were just mentioning, you were talking about the two hemispheres, left, right, left and right. And so fundamentally, the left being transactional, right? And then the right being more relational, we might say.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then that can be further divided into another hemispheric dimension, so front and back. But nonetheless, the shift, we basically, as most people in sort of in conversation are kind of coming to, is this sort of reliance on the left brain and the goal oriented sort of linear thinking, et cetera. And so, and that has essentially gotten us to a point of, you know, fairly, great heights in terms of our technological and material progress, with fairly little to show for the larger sort of spiritual and more humane sort of aspects of our shared humanity. And I think that's reached just frankly a place of diminishing returns, where we're no longer able to actually live this way and reap the same benefits as we have. And I think that's where the shift is coming. And that's why you're actually seeing this remarkable turn, sort of both inward and outward, but based upon more of really looking for experiential impact versus measurable outcomes. That's the fundamental difference between the two. From my research, is that the transactional mind is really captivated by measurable outcomes. In fact, that's actually how it understands everything in terms of those sort of frameworks and sort of what do you call it when you're building a building, and you have the thing that everybody, the scaffolding, right? So
Scaffolding. Yeah.
so scaffolding and framework, right? And that's really what it's all about. Whereas the relationships are where the meat is, the meat on the bone, and the where the sort of the mind is actually sort of in its own sort of nature, you might say, as a being, as an organism, versus as something trying to be something, basically. And so, and this is a pervasive and natural sort of turning of our shared humanity away from what doesn't work anymore.
Wow. I would, I, I'm tempted to say, well, thank you for being on here because you've said everything that needs to be said. There's nothing more to, well, of course, that's not true. There's a lot more to be said by that. You said that there is a relational paradigm shift. I think that's the terminology used to describe the podcast. So tell me, what is that paradigm that you see? Let's talk about this as paradigms, and maybe we could talk about it in terms of other podcasts where the old paradigm is there, and now this is a new paradigm. Um, and one way I would describe it is that I get people almost every day reaching out to me, particularly through LinkedIn, wanting to sell me their services in the promotion of this podcast, and I ignore most of them because I know that they're mostly interested in generating numbers. and I'm interested in generating relationships.
Mm.
So what do you think of that? How do you respond to that?
It's makes sense to me. I mean, frankly, and yeah, so it's the thing is it's so pervasive, right? And those of us who know who really are like in this conversation right now, I feel like have known it most of their lives, frankly. And the way that I would put it is there's no integrated relational infrastructure, right? So even when people want more relationships, they don't know how to go about it. They just literally don't understand what that arena of engagement really means to play in for themselves. And
I
so I
agree.
think it's by virtue of your experience and the emergent kind of manifestation of it, right? That is providing this perfect kind of introduction to what so many other people are afraid of. I mean, the vulnerability alone that you avail for others in just putting on this, like even the way that you initially sort of got on the call with me, right? Is there's just this quality of being with the conversation, in the conversation, not somewhere else, judging from a place of, what am I going to get out of this? Right.
And well, there is an agenda. The agenda
Well,
is to have a
but that's what's
conversation.
important. Yeah. Okay. This is beautiful. And then, so this is something that I've learned from my mentor and dear friend, Olaf Hermans. Right. And this
Oh,
is
Furman.
that,
Oh, yeah. He's
yeah,
been on the podcast.
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And
I love Olaf. Yeah.
he is my a dear friend. And I honestly, he's helped me as much as anybody ever has in my life,
Oh, I'm
to be
so
honest.
glad to hear that.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal what he has to offer, even in the sort of lack of infrastructure that he's constantly sort of meeting with. I think as you are too, right? Because on some level, it's like why isn't there like a social or a relational networking platform where you can just tie all these people, from all these different networks into one place, but where you don't have to be like constantly bombarded by the transactional world.
You
It's
want
just,
you want me to
it's
answer
like,
that? You want me to answer that?
please, if you, yeah, what do you
Oh,
think of
yeah.
that?
I mean, this was a moment of conflict last fall for me because I'm thinking about where do I take this thing? And I really like my guests. And I miss not having conversation with them. And I'm thinking, I want to create an online community of my guests. And I started working on that. And I started
Mhm.
and I explored the technology of that. I looked at mighty networks and other forms of communal relationships online. And I came to realize that it wouldn't work
And I
because
tried it.
signing up for an institutional application of someone else's understanding of what relationships is. And so I just have to, so I tell you what I really want to do. I'd like to at least once a quarter travel somewhere in the world and gather my guests together for a day together,
Mm.
unscripted, and to see what might occur from that.
I think it's brilliant.
I did this
I mean,
in
I literally think that's brilliant. I think that's brilliant.
I did this in October. I went to London for the McGilchrist Day on the future of humanity, and
Mhm.
that was a great event. I loved that
Mhm.
event. Saw a bunch of people that I have met through the podcast and through other friends, and I invited people. I sent out word to all the people I knew in the UK.
Mhm.
Come to come to London on Sunday afternoon, and we're going to gather at the Crown in Covent Garden, and we'll have beers together. And that was about 40 some odd people that I invited, and it turns out that was the wrong time to do it. But there were 8 of us that gathered, and it was really we were together for about 2.5 hours, and it was beautiful. And so I said, so this is somehow I have to figure out how to do this. And I just recognize I'm just a catalyst for getting other people together.
Yeah. And I think so. One of the things that we are sort of proposing as a potential infrastructural support is something along the lines of a goodwill marketplace, right? Because so many people have things that they want to do with one another, that they just feel like, well, but if I'm not going to get paid, or if I don't know how I'm going to get paid, kind of thing, then I just don't feel comfortable right now because I need to get paid, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
And so what we need is a place where basically people can reach into the world as they see fit, and then be sort of presented with potential investment opportunities, both time, they can be money, etc. And then based upon that, the relationship kind of can begin to apply itself to those endeavors, to those enterprises. Right. So a grassroots kind of building up, like, what do you want to do anyway? What are you doing anyway? Like, if you're going to do it anyway, and you don't really need to get paid, I have the opportunity for you. Right. But maybe you need to get paid a little, or maybe you need to get paid a lot, but there can be stipulations upon that. Right. Like you owe us a certain amount of time going forward, or I don't know, whatever. The thing is we can get really creative now. And that's something that the internet provides that we didn't have before, but we're still just playing around in the frothy kind of, fun bits of it. And I think at this point, it's again diminishing returns, right? We're kind of like in the transactional sort of mind state. We're actually less capable of actually making decisions that build kind of nexuses of meaning and value, basically.
What you're saying is that you're trying to create a a vehicle like what LinkedIn should be, but isn't.
I think you're right. I think you're right, but I almost wouldn't. That's something more
But
for the
also, yeah,
advertisers and the yeah. You got it though. Yeah, basically, I mean, I've been talking about the LinkedIn Uplift project for since I got on there years ago, like a few like in 2020 or 2019 or whatnot, and but it's there is not the infrastructure for this type of enterprising yet effectively. And so yeah, exactly. And this is why it's so important is just these conversations to just be, the more of these conversations we have that where people can acknowledge their own needs and the needs that aren't being met, and then we can see how much goodwill there is out there, frankly. I mean, and that's one of the things, you're a shining light on LinkedIn as far as I'm concerned, Ed. I mean, without any smoke, it's straight up the way that you're helping people sort of introduce themselves to each other,
yeah.
right? And then the way that you're owning sort of the process, and letting it be really open, I think, is so powerful. And I can tell it's through your own vulnerability and your own, like, meeting your own fear and anxiety that you really are pushing forward. And I can't honor that enough, frankly. To me, it's you're like my hero in that way.
No one's ever said that to me before, and I'm that it means a lot. It means
Yeah.
a lot because for some of us, we have we have practiced these things in the wilderness, and no one noticed. There's never any affirmation,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not saying I need affirmation. I need validation. I'm not saying that I'm searching for that. I think that's a byproduct of something other, which is
Mm.
I really want people to feel like they have a place where they're heard, they're appreciated, and they have a way of figuring out what is it that I can do, and what is it that I can do really well, and what is it I can do if I am willing to give up all the false securities that exist for us.
That's right. And it's those false securities, though, that for many people, unfortunately, are the only securities.
That's right.
And that's, I think, the world that we have to really come to terms with as these caring, intelligent human beings that we are, that basically we've dug ourselves a hole, right? And I've dug myself a real holes in life, that I had to dig myself out of. Right. And so
I've done the same.
how that is.
Yes.
Right. And so there's a point at which we just have to stop scrambling at the edges of our captivity, right? Where we have to accept where we are, and we have to deeply sort of open our eyes to the nuances of this somewhat dark and sort of scariness that we're living with, in order to actually find sort of what we can rely on, what we can actually build with, what we can scrape away from the walls to then pile together into the ramp that leads us out, right? And the problem is that we've done it, in the manner of divide and conquer, as the corporations willed it, right? And this was a corporate effort. This wasn't a one person on high. This was literally a corporate effort, right? And I think that's the ownership we need to take back as individual humans, in order to be responsible and take responsibility back, in order to really define our way forward as individuals and in more close-knit community, frankly.
What I'm finding is that there are people all over the world who feel the same way, but they are alone in feeling the same way.
They feel alone in feeling the same way because they're not alone, right?
They're not alone, but they are alone where they live in their locality.
That's valid. Yeah, I totally get what you
mean. So when the subtitle of the podcast is Global Conversations for Local Leaders, I'm really looking at these local leaders, like this coming Thursday's podcast is with a young woman from Pakistan that she popped up on my LinkedIn feed at 8 o'clock one Tuesday morning. And I'd spent some time in Pakistan. I spent a summer in Pakistan back in 1981. And I said, I want to meet her because she's doing leadership with women and I want to meet her. So I just sent her a note saying, hey, I'd like to get to know you. I'd like to have you on the podcast. And she said, oh, that sounds great. So I sent her the invitation. And she immediately responded to the invitation. And I started at 8 o'clock in the morning looking at her stuff. And we had a scheduled interview at 1 o'clock that afternoon. So in about 5 hours, we went from not knowing that each other existed to having a kind of conversation that we're having. And it was remarkable. It was a remarkable conversation. And I feel humbled by being able to meet people who I have such great respect because they're pathfinders, they're discoverers, they're the explorers, that they're the Lewis and Clark of the 21st century. They're not looking to conquer physical landscape. They're looking at trying to conquer relational landscape, shall we say, and how to build.
Well, I'd say I'd like to interrupt there on a very important note, just for myself, just because this is when we're talking about infrastructure a bit. So for the relational, everything is in a way already conquered, frankly. And not in the sense that the front of brain, the left brain kind of views it, but in the sense of all of our decisions are being filtered through the matrix of the relational. And that's actually why we've reached such a hard stop in terms of the diminishing returns. right? Because fundamentally, we are actually built to relationally align, not just outwardly, but inwardly.
Well, I would say that I agree to a point, but that relational, whatever that is, conception that is presented to us is really a simulated relationship. It's not real. It's not like if you called me up tomorrow morning and said, "Can you come? Can you come? I need you to come be with me in the situation that I'm in tomorrow. I need someone to stand beside me as I go through this. Would you come?" And I would say, "Sure, I'd be there." I'd get in my car and I'd drive overnight to be with you because that's what the relationship calls for. That's not what we're seeing in the relationships that tend to take place in social media. Those are more connections. That's
Right.
where I'm going with this.
Right, totally. And so this, I've been reading something by Harmit Rosa,
Uh-huh.
called Uncontrollability of the World, right? And
I got
that's,
it.
yeah, okay. So that's really what I'm speaking to, right? So in a way, we're trying to use the language of transaction to actually approach something in the relational that the hard part is, and I don't think I ever got to this. It's what's so funny when we were talking about Olaf, is that is one of one of the things that he told me that made so much impact. There were two things I'd like to, I'll say them in reverse order. The first, in reverse order, was that the relational is 100% transactional. The relational is 100% transactional. And
Right.
that really, so that's where we can start. That's where we can get so confused in a certain manner of speaking, where we can use any number of languaging to actually meet the confluence of measurable outcomes and direct experience in situ as we go.
But we have to define what transaction actually means. So it's not an exchange of value, it's actually an exchange of investment. And when the transaction that I want to have with my guests is one of investment in them, because I'm investing my belief in them, in you, and I want to have greater opportunities to invest more, to sacrifice more in investing in people that I believe in. So that is a transactional, but it's transaction for the purpose of transformation.
Right. And
Not
I would almost say, yeah, and it's transaction that is fully informed by the wholeness of both agency and environment, you might
yes,
say. And that's what
yes,
makes it relational, right? So
yes, that's
what's
right.
going on is that the relational is, I mean, the transactional is essentially sort of keyed into the explicit conscious experience, right? And all the other sort of sectors, quadrants of the brain are much more sort of built to manage other parts effectively of our whole experience, right? But because of how much we got out of sort of the degree of semi-control that we've managed, right? We basically managed to fool ourselves and get drunk on that idea, and then we managed to convince ourselves that we could control it all,
Yeah.
basically. And now, and this will be interesting because I'd like to break this, because I know you have a religious background, and I do too in my own way, but more as like a crazy yogi. And so, for me, I can clearly see the need for religion in the sense of both the means of sort of giving people a place that didn't have any natural tendency to want to like be in the rat race just by virtue of their own, deep organism, you might call it. And then at the same time, a way for the powers that be, frankly, that really were in control, whether other people liked it or not, to actually utilize that capacity, that human capacity. Right. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is like that's shifting,
Yeah.
frankly. We've gotten to a critical mass. And I think this is something where your direct experience and personal experience has so much to offer in that transition in transitioning away from the manner in which the principles had to be sort of explored and experienced then versus what the principles have to be, how they have to be explored and experienced today, right? Because it's such a different world. And I think it does have everything to do with that spectacle of the real. And I think it comes down to a honoring the experience of the real, even in reflection as spectacle. And because that's what people like you are starting to be like, you're starting to take hold of the spectacle more. You're starting to say, yes, of course. Yes, we've gotten confused by it. It's just like a child as it grows up, and it gets all these names and numbers and objects in its conception, and yet it doesn't really know how to use them, right? Yet. And so that's exactly the way we are as a collective humanity with regard to these fundamental intelligences that are actually all arising quite differently in all of us, but at the same time, there's natural sort of ties that bind. I mean, even in terms of pheromonal response and whatnot, that governs the epigenetic display of our shared humanity, that actually does govern the wholeness, even as it's trying to either fragment or take control of itself, one part taking control of another. There's a sense of holism there that that is very reminiscent of the homeostatic intelligence of our own individual organisms. And I think that's where we can all start. That's sort of the natural yoga, right? Is the more we begin to accept ourselves and delve into the right relationship we have with our world, what actually just really feels good and right for us, the more we can honor that for others.
I think that there is the change that we're going through is moving towards what you're describing. But where we have been, and this is what I saw when I first began to study what became the spectacle of the real, which was back in 2012. That's back when I began to look at this. What I found then, and I still think it's true now, is that the spectacle is this manufactured perception of the world or reality, which is fed to us that we're supposed to kind of adopt as the reality that we're supposed to live into. And so, and we're not really allowed to be critical of it. We're not even allowed to ask questions of it. I mean, you look at what's happening in countries all over the world where they're denying, where they're taking away the freedom of speech, which is exactly what the spectacle of the real is. It's the denial of your agency to think as a human being, to have conversations with people. It's all of that, and it's a sign. It's a sign that the culture that has supported that way of thinking is failing, and it's failing at a very rapid rate because people see it for what it actually is. And so what is it that they want? Spectacle is not a bad thing when it's something that you choose to have and you choose to create. Like, a birthday party is a spectacle, and you gather together and you celebrate and you sing happy birthday to the guest or to the person whose birthday it is. That's a spectacle, and it can have a transformative effect upon us. And I think in the best sense, religion or spirituality has that kind of effect upon us. But the problem is that the modern world that we've lived with for 300 or 400 years now, has been ordered around ordering the lives of people and basically removing them from their agency, removing them from their thoughts, their ability to think for themselves. And as a result, they become automatons. They're machines. They're utilitarian mechanisms for the global consumer machine. And that's where we've kind of been, but it's failing at a very, very rapid rate. And I don't think we even have to challenge it. It's challenging itself. Its own demise is embedded in its own way it's organized and operating. So what is it that we do? We have to to think differently. We just have to begin to act differently. And I think it's that we celebrate people's successes and we celebrate people's gifts and we celebrate, having a conversation like this. And and that's where this idea of traveling around the world and hosting a little events, it's a spectacle of the real, but it's a spectacle of the real, the real that comes in our relationships with one another.
Yeah, so I would encourage you to fully implement the spectacle of the real as a kind of as a sort of meta approach, so that what you're really showing is the way that the case, like sort of the case against reality, the way it works is like, yes, we're built for fitness, not for knowing the truth of all things. We're built for fitness. And so the spectacle of the real is on some level just the coming to terms with that. Like we don't have the real, we have the spectacle of the real, but that's precisely in our sort of our wheelhouse. Like, because once we acknowledge that, we can go, well, how do I feel? Is this working for me? Is this what I want to be, the story of my life that I want to be watching right now? And if we live in a society like that isn't authoritarian and et cetera, then we have the ability to turn it off, to turn off the TV, to turn off the radio. I mean, in other countries now, you're right, it's getting to the point where you can't turn off even in this country, there's people that if you try to turn off MSNBC or Fox News, they're going to have a problem. They're going to be like, no, that's how I know what's happening in my world, basically. And then that is when I think people have lost touch with the spectacle of the real and they think they're in reality, basically. And I think it used to be that people, they had more of a more of a regular conversation about that with the people that they were really in relationship with. But we've been so divided and conquered that people are afraid to tell each other, it doesn't really seem that real to me.
Yeah. And I think that people, when they receive a blow like the pandemic, it has a kind of a chastening aspect to it. Why am I in this situation? Is this what I want for my life? I mean, when people begin to ask that question, is this what I want for my life? Then they begin to think for themselves and begin to say, I want something different. And the question is, well, how do I understand what that difference is and how do I get there? But you see, in that in itself is where life is discovered. And that's where the spectacle becomes the spectacle of the real. And it's a good thing. But
I think maybe we're talking about two different things, Ed. I think maybe what we need to do is we need to say there's a spectacle of the real, which is essentially what all of us do, even on an individual basis, which is make up a bunch of stories because that's what we think will work. And then we find out it won't, right? Yeah. The journey of the real, right? The real journey. I think we should call it the real journey, the spectacle of the real versus the real journey. Because really what we think can never be it. That's the real problem. Nothing is as it appears, nor is it otherwise. And there's no problem with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what I'm seeing, and this is where my writing has taken me in talking about reality, is that we can't control reality. We don't even have a grasp on reality, but we know it exists.
Or we are reality. I think that's it. That's it. We're still talking within the framework of the transactional paradigm. Once we get to relational paradigm shift, we truly will see we are reality. We just are reality talking to itself, right? And so as soon as we have this sense of separating ourselves from that reality, right, we immediately get into the spectacle of the real. As soon as we have a sense of talking about ourselves about it rather than just being in it.
I'm not suggesting that we spend any time analyzing reality. I'm really saying we just live in reality and we experience it And and the way I've just come to see this, reality is existence, and consciousness, which we haven't talked about yet, but consciousness is a huge topic out there today. And I would say that consciousness is simply the nonverbal communication that happens between us and reality. We become more aware of what's going on, and that's a growing consciousness. But we become aware because we are living in the midst of an environment where it's feeding our sensory selves, which is having an effect upon our brains, and all of a sudden we begin to realize that a lot of the language that we've been using is really very forced and wooden and cold and not very articulate. Imagine analytical thought not being articulate, but it's not, because it's not able to describe what I have experienced.
And that's precisely the emotional sort of roots of decision making too, right? So if we're not able to have that sort of genuine relationship to the world, right, then we're necessarily not going to be able to make decisions that are truly going to have our own and that which we care about best interests in mind, at heart, at the very least, right? So even as we think, oh yeah, we're working towards this, because there's that sense of, oh, but I'm never able to honor that part of me, right? There's always that part of life that just seems to always be missing, right? And yet we're always kind of inadvertently denying ourselves of it, simply by virtue of the fact that it doesn't fit in a certain way otherwise, right? And I think that's the vulnerability. I think, so this is what's interesting, is so much of this comes down to trauma and then relational support through trauma. Because with trauma, it's a fundamental dislocation, basically. And I think with that fundamental dislocation, it's very difficult to reach out from a place of dislocation, right? And so that's when we're more built to be sort of brought into a larger whole, a larger community, and then healed actually within that community. The problem is now is that people know this on some basic level, but the infrastructure isn't there. They don't have the actual communities and relationships to hold these broken people, basically. And so they bring them in, and then they end up oftentimes just having, just really a problematic relationship with each other, and then it spreads throughout their community and their organizations and whatnot. And I think being able to acknowledge the spectacle from the journey is what really allows us to start having conversations about what really needs to be talked about for that person. Because a lot of times I think the people who are already well, situated and comfortable are like, oh yeah, let me analyze this for you, where the person that's on the street is like, no, let me tell you about my journey. How, is there a refuge for me somewhere along the way? And this person's like, oh yeah, let me talk to you about the refuge, along the way. And instead of actually showing them how to get there, basically. And I think this is the bridge that we need.
Let me take this one step further.
Please.
I don't think it is possible for us to understand reality without having some trauma or some suffering, because it awakes us to that which we have either lost or been denied or have failed to achieve. And those two together, the opposites of pain and peace or whatever, of suffering and happiness, or whatever those opposites are, those opposites are what give us a real sense of clarity about the world that we're living in. And so, but so much of the world we are living in is wanting us to look at the trauma and the suffering as something's wrong and to be avoided. And
Truly,
we want happiness and peace but we can't really understand why those things are valuable unless we have grown to see the value of the suffering that we must go through to achieve the places we want to be in life.
wholeheartedly. And not all of us are here to suffer as much or to go through as
That's
much
right.
trauma. And so I think that that can be really tricky because you have people that literally go through their lives without any real trauma. And then they're literally told nowadays, oftentimes, without trauma, you're not really human, you know? And then they're basically, oh, yeah, thanks for that. You know, and I'm not saying that's what you're saying at all, Ed, but I'm actually sort of starting to glean that with people that really have so much to offer, but haven't been traumatized. They don't understand the traumatic experience, right? And then they're not able to actually shed the genuine wisdom and knowledge that they have onto those topics because of that misalignment. And that's precisely having to do with what you're mentioning about the spectacle of the real and the way our society is organized, frankly. Because if we had more of a relational approach, then like in a family, it's like you know, you don't wait for somebody to be on death's door before you introduce them to the nephew who knows medicine, you know?
That's right.
Right. You just
Right.
don't. And that's what we've gotten to a point where that's literally where it's even worse than that. We're like, if you don't have insurance, I understand you're a fellow human being, but you can literally go die out on the street now. Right. And those are sometimes people who know each other. So
Yeah.
imagine how fucked up that is, Ed. Like literally, you know this person that you have to basically resign to their own death because you just literally have too many other people to take care of might that you might be able to help because of the system. And that's the infrastructure that we need to change, that needs to change desperately.
And it's it's that, but it's also the reality that many of the people who are suffering um, worldwide see that someone else is responsible for alleviating their suffering. And so they're looking for, I mean, it's like these, and I don't assume they're homeless people, but people who hang out on the little curb between on the at turning on roads where people are turning and they're sitting there and they're collecting coins because the perception is that they're homeless. Well, many of them are not homeless. They have places to live. This is just the way they make a living, which is by begging for coins that, from people who are, and they it's and there are people around the world who do the same thing. They look say to the West for handouts, because they have not learned how to be responsible. So I think one of the things that we should be helping people to deal with their suffering or their trauma is how do they take responsibility for their own healing. But their own healing is then becomes something that they can find other people to share in that healing. I mean, I think this is why AA is such a powerful thing, is that people are sharing their own responsibility to be healed.
Right. But also, I would say that more often than not, some of the most dynamic people that I know can't stand AA because it's just another freaking religion for them, and they're not able to be themselves in it. And so it only affords them the ability. So I'm just giving you just to
Yeah,
give you a sense of the back and forth of it. And so I guess what I'm thinking is, though, is in terms of that responsibility, right? In terms of helping other people claim their responsibility, I don't think such can be the case. I think all we can do is model it. And so I think what happens is that whenever we start to say to people, oh, you need to be more responsible, I think what we really are doing, unbeknownst to ourselves, is judging their own sense of how to get along in the world. We're judging the conversation that they're having with their world. And I think we need to shift that. That's the transactional mode, right? What we need to do, I think, is be more curious about, okay, what is it in your life that makes you feel like you don't have the ability to just, to basically take more responsibility from our point of view, right? And that's a different conversation than just projecting that they're not responsible enough and that they can't, sort of they're undeserving somehow of some support thereby. Right?
I don't see my role as saying you need to be responsible. I see my role as this is how I'm responsible for myself. And I can't do things for you that you want me to do because I have responsibilities for other things. Let me tell you
Yeah.
a
That makes
story
sense to me.
that I think kind of captures this for me. when I finished seminary in 1981, my first call was to a large Presbyterian church in Atlanta, and I was the community minister. So everything outside the doors of the church in that urban environment was my ministry, my parish. And so I had poor families and alcoholics and street people and homeless people and business community, and I had this real wide spectrum of people that I related to. And I'm a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and my little VW sitting in the parking lot of the church had a sticker on there. And I'm getting into my car at one afternoon to go home, and I hear a voice behind me say, "I went there." And I turned around, there was this homeless guy there, and I'm thinking, yeah, sure. You know, what do you want from me? You know, this is kind of the jadedness that comes if you spend too much time in this environment. And he began to tell me his story, and I realized that he was telling me things that the only way he would know these things would be to have actually been in there. And it turned out he had been a PhD student in philosophy at Chapel Hill, and one Sunday morning, his wife and his infant son or toddler son were on their way to church, and they were in an automobile accident where both killed. And it devastated him. And he says, I drank through everything I owned, and I ended up here. And so we started talking. I didn't know what I could do for him other than befriend him and listen to him. He was at that fulcrum point where he was preparing himself to be responsible for his own healing. And I saw him a lot over the course of about a year. And he was from North Carolina. He grew up in Sanford. Well, that's where his brothers were. And he came to me and says, I'm ready to go home. Will you put me on a bus to Raleigh? And I want to check into the state hospital, and I want to get dried out, and I'll go home and live with my brothers. I said, okay. So I bought him a bus ticket, and I put him on the bus thinking I would never, ever see him again. A year later, I get a phone call from him, and he'd gone through the 3 months rehab, and he had been sober ever since. And he says, I'm getting ready to leave my brothers, and I'm going to go. At that time, he said he was going to go to Durham, but he ended up going to Charlotte. And he says, I have a hard time living under a roof. And so I'm going to go live back on the streets and take care of the people who are like me. Beautiful, beautiful outcome, I thought. So that was 1985. 2005, 2006, I had begun to write a weblog, and I decided I'm going to write about Berkeley. His name was Berkeley Tulloch. I'm going to write about Berkeley, and wrote about him. And his brother, John, found out about this, and he calls me. He says, I bet you'd like to know what happened to him. I said, I really would. He said he ended up in Charlotte. He worked for the Salvation Army. He drove a truck. He would go around to all these bins where they're collecting clothing and stuff like that, and he'd empty those, and that was his job. And after about 3 years, he got sick, and they put him in the hospital. He ended up having a heart attack, and he died. And I said, well, John, did he remain sober throughout the rest of his life? He said he did. So here was a guy who had gone through extreme trauma of losing his family, who somehow found a way to get his life back and put it in order and live a meaningful life to the end. And that to me is kind of the example of, it's not just for Berkeley, it's for me and you, for all those people we know. We have to kind of take that kind of approach to life. And if we do, then we have a story to tell. And when we tell that story to someone who needs to hear it, then maybe we have the chance of having an effect upon them in a way that is transformative for them. That's always my hope.
I love it. And I love that story. And I wonder though, how much you're really seeing your own, role in that, because it's not like he could ask that to anybody, or,
That's right.
you could get that support. And without that support, honestly, there's no way to say that he wouldn't have kept drinking and eventually change. I mean, not to say that, you know, I don't know how reality really works, right? Maybe there is a certain, a push come to shove that we're here to experience. I'm not sure, frankly. But at the same time, it's the one thing I think that I'm getting from this conversation in a very powerful way is the way that we've distended personal responsibility from compassionate activity. We have somehow gotten into this notion that these two things are somehow opposites, somehow, when the exact opposite is true. That they are like, we are not compassionate because we have more than we can give. We're compassionate because we know what it means to have less. And from that experience, we naturally want to give into it from the more that we have.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the response to all that is that we prepare ourselves to show up every day and be available to people.
Right.
Nothing more than that, not knowing what they need and being able to provide whatever it is that we have to offer in a way that may make a difference that matters. I mean,
Right. And
that's really kind of where I began my whole thought process about the circle of impact almost, I guess 25 years ago. That's what I was seeing. The need for people to show up and take initiative to make a difference and not having it all planned out. But the idea of taking initiative in that moment is really the key to living a flourishing life.
yeah, and I love to say, Olaf likes to say this is a paradox, but I love this compassion inspiring excellence, because I needed a hashtag, hashtag compassion inspiring excellence. And I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
See, that's what really, because as these kind of more diminutive human, less mature human beings, we think that like the maturity at the end goal is like, we're these great puffed up human beings and, oh, we're so adult and successful. But really, I mean, that's asinine. If you think about evolution and you think about the actual way of life, the point of us getting to that point is to take care of the little ones, to actually provide more for the whole moving forward. And unfortunately, that is what this sort of this psychological myopathy is, or myopia, yeah, is,
I know
that
what you
word,
mean. Yes.
narrow thinking. Yeah, narrow thinking, and I think that the conversation, it's really interesting because it's this play. I'm really realizing it's this play. So what happens is we become traumatized, right? And then we harden up, right? We kind of, right? And then what needs to happen is there needs to be enough in us to be able to look into the world and find the light, right? And then that light has to be able to shine upon us, basically. And so as we get older and we've been through life in that way, we learn that we need to be the light that shines. And that's it. That's it. And if we do that in any way we can, I mean, I have so many flaws, it's ridiculous, frankly, but I've learned to be that flawed person by owning those flaws and by doing the best not to make those flaws other people's problem, right? And in that process, I've learned to enjoy myself immensely, frankly, because I am who I am. I don't begrudge myself my own way, but I see that I have to be sort of I say this, and I love to sort of hear your thoughts on this. This is sort of what everything I came up with Bodhyana yoga years ago, and it's Chariot of Awakening, and it all sums up to this: forgiveness and gratitude are the essence of the path. Mere awareness, its ground, and freedom from suffering, the result. And that's it.
I like that.
That's it.
I think that's a good place for us to stop for today.
I just can't get enough of you, Ed. Since I've known you, I had a good feeling about
Well,
you.
that honor,
That first
I'm
meeting.
so honored by that. but what it means is that there's something that we'll be able to do together continually over the next many years. And I don't know what tomorrow. Do I know what tomorrow is? I know a little bit about tomorrow.
Yeah.
I really don't know what tomorrow brings. Um, and I like that. I like that. But what you described to me not only gives me a great deal of satisfaction, but also hope, because
Mhm.
what you have identified is what I see, and to have someone else to see it as clearly as I think I see it, maybe I don't see it clearly enough, gives me hope that okay, maybe we're we're turning a corner, and the question is how do we um, bring others along with us? And I think that's what you and Olaf are kind of talking about. And I'd like to know
Yeah.
more about that. And so maybe you and Olaf and I should have a conversation. And we will
Oh,
do
most definitely.
so.
And I think I've shared this with you before, but keep the conversation ongoing and the ongoing conversational. It sounds trite, but it is incredibly powerful,
I
incredibly powerful. And
totally.
that's what I see you doing, Ed, and it's brilliant. Thank you so much, really, from bottom of my heart.
Well, the thing is, and I'm saying this not only to you, but to all those who are watching, there are
Mhm.
all kinds of people that have not been on, kinds of people. Okay.
Mhm.
I hate to say it where I'm giving them a label. There are kinds of
Mhm.
people who have not been on the podcast that I really would like to talk to. And
Mhm.
because I'm curious about who they are, I don't sit in judgment. I'm just really curious, and I'm looking at, in particular, younger people, millennials, yes,
Mhm.
but particularly Gen Zs and Gen Alphas. I'm looking for my first middle school interview, and that's I can't wait for that, because I want to hear about their language. They have a middle schoolers have a slang that's developing in the cities, which is really amazing. It's just I've heard some of it, and I'm thinking, oh, I've got to learn about this. I got to learn about this. It's just great.
I love it. That is fantastic. Just that right there, Ed. That right. That is the what in the Dharma, it's the youth body, right? The vase body, right? And you can
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
it in your belly. That's that energy and that joy, right? Never, yes. Never give up, always surrender. Never give up, always surrender. Yeah, man. I'm so happy. Just thank you so much. And yeah, man. You just
great.
I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you as well. And thank you all for watching. Please sign up and hit the like button and leave a comment. Share it with us, with people. And if you know someone you think should be on the podcast, let me know, because I'd love to invite them to come. And we have a new season starting here in a few weeks. And I'm looking forward to seeing what new things will come from that. So, Chris, thank you for
Right
being here.
on.
We'll talk some more, and we'll see you all
Most
next time
definitely.
here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.